Coming up next on the Holistic Wealth Podcast.
I would say getting ready to take what we call like long-term travel or a long-term trip is also a lot harder than it seems on paper. Because again, in these headlines and in these kind of inflated, large, lofty ideas, it says, I quit my job to travel the world, and it makes it seem like people just left. But you have to take 10 steps back. I guess as soon as we booked those flights and knew that we were going to go and we had sorted our jobs and somewhat of our plans, we started selling things and giving them away.
You're listening to the Holistic Wealth Podcast with host Keisha Blair, author of Holistic Wealth and founder of the Institute on Holistic Wealth. And now, here's your host, Keisha Blair.
Welcome to the Holistic Wealth Podcast, and I'm your host, Keisha Blair, and today we have a very special guest with us. We have Becca Siegel from Half Half Travel, and Becca is a digital content creator who co-founded Half Half Travel with her husband, Dan. Together, they share travel destination guides, photography, travel advice, and remote work tips with their audiences around the world. Becca has been featured in Oprah Magazine, Condé Nast, Traveler, Lonely Planet, Travel and Leisure, MSN News, Cosmo, and so many other publications. And she's contributed travel stories to the Huffington Post, USA Today, Yahoo Finance, and so much more. Becca, welcome to the Holistic Wealth Podcast. It's great having you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here today.
Awesome. It's great to have you here because for many people and for some who are listening in for the very first time, Holistic Wealth does include travel and meaningful experiences. And I spoke about that in my book, Holistic Wealth, as well with my 1-year sabbatical abroad. So I've always been, I'm a big travel fan myself personally. And I know with your story, I just want you to share with our audience because you left a toxic job and you transitioned into being a digital nomad and starting on this journey. And I think that's a great place to start because so many people are thinking about transitioning, whether it's transitioning to move to another country or to work remotely somewhere else or thinking about all sorts of different things. So can you tell us about your experience from your toxic job to this lifestyle?
One thing I do want to make clear is that the internet makes it seem like quitting your job and traveling the world is a very easy thing to do. And in my experience, It took a ton of prep, a lot of courage, and a bunch of risk. So I just want to make that clear for people because there are so many headlines that say, I quit my job to travel the world and here's how I'm excelling and here's all my success and things like that. I don't want to say it's not all that it's chalked up to be. It certainly is, but there's a bit more to my story than the headlines itself. So I'm so glad you asked. Basically, I actually just put out an article called How I Convinced My Employer to Let Me Travel and Work Remotely. And that outlines the entire story, which is, in a few bullet points, it is this. So I was at a job in New York City at a small company for quite a few years, and I stuck with it because change is one of the hardest things to do in your life. I'm sure you'll agree with that. Coping with change is one of, I think, the most psychologically challenging things to do. And so by sticking at a job, despite the fact that I wasn't moving up and I wasn't happy and I didn't feel like I was growing, staying somewhere was the easiest thing for me to do. And it was the path of least resistance to stay at a job rather than taking all the steps to look for a new one and, interviewing and doing all that type of just more work. So I did come up with a plan with my husband, who at the time was my boyfriend. And he said, I've seen you really unhappy and just frustrated and even really anxious that you're not going anywhere in this job and that it's just kind of like you're sitting stagnant there. He said, why don't we quit our jobs and travel the world? And so the background story to that is that Dan, my husband and business partner, had taken his job remotely to travel the world with a work and travel program where he didn't have to quit his job. He took his job remotely as a web developer for a nonprofit, and he traveled with a program. So the itinerary was cut out for him, and he paid a monthly fee, which at the time was about $2,000. And the company that he was traveling with, called Remote Year, set him up with a group of travel buddies. It was 75 people at the time, and a co-working space where everybody would work remotely, and accommodation and a bunch of activities and transport from place to place. So the way it went was I put in notice with my boss's boss, and I said, I'm leaving. And he said, oh my gosh, well, everyone else is quitting also. What can we do to keep you? And I said, nothing. I have a one-way flight to Europe booked. And actually, what I thought in that moment was, I'm really going to need money on this like remote work, quit your job travel trip. So about 2 days later, I went back to my boss's boss and I said, what if the company hires me back as a remote part-time employee? And that was interesting to him at that moment because kind of like our team and our department was in flux. People were kind of leaving. So by keeping me, they kept the person with the most historic knowledge of the business and things like that. So we worked out a negotiation of me to come back after quitting as working, I think, 15 hours a week on a completely remote schedule where I said, basically, I have no plans. I'm going to be in Europe. I might be in Asia. I might be in South America. Like, you might have trouble finding me. No, I'm just kidding. I said, I'm going to be like everywhere. I'm going to be in multiple time zones, but I'm going to make this work if you're willing to keep basically paying me. And then I will have money to fund all my travels. And so that's what happened. That was kind of like the start of me not working in the traditional full-time office setting anymore. And around that time, Dan and I had started this travel blog called Half Half Travel, which was kind of just like a baby project at that time, but we were making a little bit of momentum by working on it nights and weekends. And the other part of our day, we were able to work on this business that is now, a main kind of like project for us as a business.
Yeah, no, I think you make some good points there right out of the gate with clarifying for people how they can take baby steps in terms of structuring their life and jobs to make it work by, going to an employer and saying, will you hire me on a remote work basis and knowing that I'm travel independent, location independent, and will you keep paying me? So I think, good ideas there for people listening in, wondering how to kind of dip their toes. I remember for me too, when I took my sabbatical year, I did that. I was on maternity leave and I could get my pay and live abroad and for that year. And I know there are also personal sacrifices that we make. And that's my next question to you in terms of the financial sacrifices, whether you have to rent out your home or sell your current location if you're not going to be there for an extended period of time and maybe give up other things. Like I remember packing everything I had in a 40-foot container and selling everything else. So what was that like for you from a financial perspective? Yes, you're keeping your salary, but you're giving up your location, your home, potentially, or your apartment, or where you're renting. You're potentially getting rid of your car. I remember selling mine. So what was that like from a financial perspective? And in terms of even setting up in a new location where you had to find somewhere in terms of living space, but could you just walk us through a bit of like kind of that next piece of it, which is kind of like the next steps and the nuts and bolts of how this actually works?
I would say getting ready to take what we call like long-term travel or a long-term trip is also a lot harder than it seems on paper.
Yeah.
Because again, in these headlines and in these kind of inflated, large, lofty ideas, it says, I quit my job to travel the world, and it makes it seem like people just left. But you have to take 10 steps back.
Yeah.
I guess as soon as we booked those flights and knew that we were going to go and we had sorted our jobs and somewhat of our plans, we started selling things and giving them away. And at the time, we were living in a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, New York. And so when you mentioned selling your car, I smiled because we didn't have a car. You don't want to drive there. But we had everything else to take care of.
Yeah.
We had a one-bedroom apartment that we were sharing and, had that fully furnished. We had actually only moved into it 9 months before. That was our first apartment together. And then, 8 months later, we were making grand plans to go to Europe. And then Latin America after that. Well, at the time, we didn't know that, but we were going to be away for a while and our lease was ending in August and we left in June. So we worked hard to find someone to sublet during that time between us leaving and our lease ending. And we knew that we weren't going to renew the lease. So that was about 12 weeks. And lucky for me, a good friend of mine who has now turned out to be an even better friend was going to be moving up from Washington, D.C. and needed a place to live while she searched for a longer term lease on her own.
Right.
So she rented that place from us for, I think, 6 of the 12 weeks. And we just took a loss on the other 6. And I think, we were financially just willing to do that kind of like as a sacrifice to the experience that we were going to have.
Wow.
So I think the moral of the story there is you might have to make sacrifices and to be financially prepared to do that. as well as work your hardest to get creative in finding ways for someone to take a bunch of that financial burden off your shoulders and out of your wallet.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's exactly true. And I find that a lot of this takes a lot of planning. It's not just, as you said, the headline stay, you just quit your job and tomorrow you're off to Europe. It's a lot more involved than that. And it can result in a lot of financial losses. If we're not doing this correctly, a lot of people end up back in the workplace afterwards because it wasn't planned properly. So Becca, now you had started half travel with Dan and you set that up. And that's the other piece of the entrepreneurial part that I wanted to ask you about in terms of how you monetize that, because I'm assuming at some point it became your full-time income once you transitioned out of the full-time job, right?
There's a bunch more to that story, just like totally personal. I've been in and out of a bunch of full-time jobs since then. Some have been remote, some have kind of been like remote, but from New York, and I was living in New York, so I was still in New York, even though the job was remote, and like funny things like that. I have been in and out of working for what I'll call full-time employers, working for some companies since then. Very interestingly, and kind of coincidentally, Half Travel became a full-time income around the time I was on maternity leave about a year and I guess a few months ago. My daughter is 17 months now.
Wow.
And around that time, I got laid off while on maternity leave. So I was 8 weeks into maternity leave, and then I got laid off from my tech job. And it was around that time when Dan said, you know what, this is kind of the dream. Things kind of happen serendipitously and the universe knows. And maybe it's time now to consider Half Travel as a real job rather than a project. So that's how we got here.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how these things happen. And at the time, it may seem like a bad thing, like a layoff or a job loss. And it turns out to be that window opening up for the life or for the structure of a life that you've always wanted. And so, Becca, how do you monetize your travel blog? And what is your major streams of income that allow you to do this full time? And how did you get that started?
This is one of my favorite things to talk about, just because I feel like getting a window into what the blogging world looks like is one of like the most mysterious things, especially because so many people are popping up as content creators. And that's also not something that happens overnight. So for us, we started the website back in 18. That was either, 6 or 7 years ago at this point. And we kind of started taking the website seriously. We were writing travel guides based on places we had been. You know, you Google like things to do in Paris, things to do in Rome. Our first kind of fortunate happenstance, piece of success was we wrote an article called like 12 places to take photos in Hong Kong. And much to our surprise, it wound up on page 1 of Google. It was even like the second hit in Google when you search for that phrase.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, everyone listening has Googled things to do in Austin or what should I do in San Diego, on my trip. So we were one of the top results for where to take photos in Hong Kong. And we didn't even plan that. We didn't know anything about SEO. And that was really just because we wrote a good list and I wrote it from the heart and we used our own unique photos, which is something really important in blogging, to use unique photos that are uniquely yours. It's just supposed to boost like your page's rankings and your site's authority if you use content that doesn't exist anywhere else on the internet, meaning it's uniquely yours and it's authentic. So after that kind of like success story with our Hong Kong article, we were like, okay, let's do this again. So we wrote things to do in X and places to see in Y and where to eat in, the Canary Highlands and places we were going. And we also wrote travel advice. So some of the earliest travel advice we wrote was how to travel as a couple, how to save money while traveling, and how to prepare for a long trip based on all the tips I told you about selling the things from our apartment and getting ready to go take a really long trip around the world. And then 2020 came. And now I feel like 2020 was so kind of long ago that we can talk about it like it was this point in history.
I know.
But basically, if you remember, no one was traveling. So to us, this was a time to pivot. And we didn't know what that was going to be for us. But at the time, we said, well, no one is Googling how to take a flight to Europe or even to another part of the country. What if we write about how to work from home? So we did. And some of our most popular content around then was how to connect with people remotely while you're working from home, and how to set up a home office and the best practices for working from home, and how to have remote meetings and how to work with companies in other time zones and things like that. And as travel came back into, the global sphere of things that were opening back up, everyone remembers, they said Japan is opening back up, France is opening back up, and things were opened up again. So we started writing about how to work remotely and travel, because that was something we had done that we wanted to share with the world of how you can do this and consider this. And so a lot of our success came from that kind of topic. And since then, we've started writing about how to travel as a family as our daughter was born. And we've done some flying with her. And she went to South America for her first time with us this past winter. So I think our content is now kind of like far and wide. We try to relate it all back to travel. But your original question was, how are we monetizing? So how did we turn this into a business? I will say that A, it did not happen overnight. And B, it takes a lot of hard work.
Does.
The most meaningful thing is that between me and Dan, I do a lot of our writing, and Dan happens to be a web developer by trade, so he knows how to build a website.
Yeah.
So between us, and he's also a photographer, we kind of use all of those talents together to build what you see when you visit Half Half Travel and surf all of our content. And there are people who start travel blogs, alone, not as a team, and they use a kind of platform like WordPress or Squarespace to build their blog, but Dan, because this is his background, he built our website from scratch. And so then I do a lot of our writing, and then I'm also like the voice of our social media. And if you reach out by email, you can talk to me. So again, how is it monetized? In short, we have display ads, which means if you're surfing our content, you might also see some ads for hotels or apparel, or even just something that Google knows you're interested in. Maybe it's like lights for your house, which is something I've been Googling this week. We also work with affiliate content, which means if you buy a backpack from one of our articles about backpacks, it means you pay the regular price for that backpack, but we might make a small commission. And that's because we've done the work to promote that. And we've usually taken photos of that product, with maybe me modeling it or us using it or showing the features of it.
Right.
And the last way that our business makes revenue is by working on some sponsorships with brands. And we don't do too many of these, but sometimes a brand will reach out to us and say, we'd love you to do a dedicated article about these 12 products that are new to the season for our company. And so they'll send us a bunch of items to try out, and then I'll write a review on my thoughts on those. And so that's a way to do a sponsorship. But actually, a lot of it started happening only after 2021 and up until that point. So for about like 4 years, Half Half Travel was a hobby and a project. It took those like 4 years to turn it more into a business. So for anyone who's starting or wants to start out, I think the key is patience. And that is one of the hardest things to talk about, but being patient in a business. And as an entrepreneur, the same thing, but success rarely happens overnight. And if it does, you've struck gold, but you still need to keep working. So I think that's the bottom line.
Absolutely. And I was listening to you on another podcast. The discussion was around the whole digital nomad lifestyle. There's so much around it that just seems so surreal that, people just pack up their lives and they think it's just instant. It's just this instant thing that happens and everything just takes place so fast. But it really does take a lot of planning. And so I wanted to ask you, in terms of your life now, in terms of how you work and travel, are you living kind of what we call that digital nomad lifestyle? And tell us about how you live and work now and organize your travel, especially with a new baby. How does that work in terms of your current lifestyle?
So we moved into a house, our first kind of forever home, earlier this year outside New York City. And so we're raising our daughter here, and that's been really great. And we're not having a travel lifestyle at the moment, just focusing on the house, which for any homeowners out there, they know is a lot of work. A lot of work and a lot of investment, but it's been a lot of fun. We are still traveling, when we get a chance. And of course, we take every travel opportunity to create content. So we went to Colombia and to Medellin, which is a great place to travel for anyone looking for a new destination for a vacation this year. And we went there to visit some friends, and we took our daughter, and we think she loved it because we had a good time and we think she had a good time. We were away for about 12 days earlier this year, kind of like February into March, which again is a beautiful time to be there. And last year we went to Halifax, Canada, which was an awesome place to explore. And I think a lot of Americans tend to forget about Eastern Canada as a vacation destination. It was totally awesome. So we're hoping to do more of that type of, short stint travel with her, because traveling as a family is, how do we put it? Less of a vacation, more of just traveling and taking care of your child elsewhere.
Right.
Is how I'll put it.
Absolutely. And as a mom of 3, I know that all too well. It really is just work elsewhere. I think I'm at the point now, though, where I have one in university and 2 others who are almost heading there. So we've started to do more couple time travel, which is, an amazing phase, I have to say. But absolutely, I love how you outline the different stages and phases of life and how you make it work. A lot of people are thinking about summer travel plans now. They're thinking about, okay, what do we do this year? So you mentioned a few destinations. Are there any other travel tip that you would have for people seeking a summer getaway or adventure time in the summer months?
That's a great question. One of my mantras through the years has kind of been to go a bit more on the paths less traveled. And so for me, I get way more of a kick out of going somewhere. I mean, pre-baby, I was going to pretty wild places. Now we kind of tame it down a little. We want to keep her safe. But before she was born, we were going to Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Nicaragua, Guatemala, Ecuador. I've been through most of Asia, through living abroad in China and Hong Kong. Dan and I spent a while in Taiwan and Vietnam. These places are just really far away from where we call home now, and I don't really feel like dealing with the jet lag. Really, when it all comes down to it, I'm so glad I spent a lot of time in those places before the baby, and I hope to bring her back one day. I think we're just going to stay maybe on this side of the world. South America totally checks a lot of the boxes for me if we want to take a trip with her. Something a lot of people on the East Coast and in Central and as well as the West Coast of the U.S. tend to glaze over is that all of South America is in our time zones. And so you barely deal with jet lag when you go to Central and South America.
Yes. We were recently in Mexico and I thought, wow, this is an easy, nice, fun trip. And it's one of those places where you're absolutely right. You have all the conveniences and, everything that you need. And I think the Caribbean is pretty similar. But so Becca, I know we were talking about money previously, and I know a lot of people thinking about not only travel, but long-term travel, think about the money aspect. And as you're thinking about entrepreneurial endeavors, if people are listening in and thinking about doing that with travel, they're wondering, okay, how do I make this work? I had in the past have a lot of our guests take the personal financial identity quiz, because the insights that we've got from previous guests have been so amazing when they tell us, what their personal financial identity is and how they see it reflected in their day-to-day budgeting, spending, all of that. So can you just tell us what your results were and how you see it show up in terms of your lifestyle? Because I do talk a lot about that in the book, Holistic Wealth, especially in the expanded and updated edition. There's a whole chapter on that.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell everyone listening that Keisha basically pinned me as a minimalist as we were even just chatting before recording. And she said, you've got to take this quiz. We're going to see if I'm right. And she was right. And I think you read people really well. And I've been dying to tell you that, because when I got my result, I was like, well, this is pretty on brand. And she read me immediately. And how I see it show up in my lifestyle. Basically, to me, I feel like I always just tell myself, today is a great day to save if I can. And while we were traveling, we tried to keep costs down and experiences minimal, meaning we never really dished out for a crazy experience anywhere. We were just trying to live really normal, modest lives just somewhere else.
Yes.
So we were in Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Taiwan, Vietnam. We were in the Canary Islands, Ireland, Portugal, Czech Republic, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, just to name a few. And the things we were trying to do together that we agreed on was we're going to try to cook, which to a lot of people doesn't make sense. Oh, you're in this place. Why would you not be eating out at restaurants? I will say that actually we ate at the most restaurants in Vietnam, because going out to dinner in Vietnam can almost be cheaper than it is to buy the food and make it yourself. But for everywhere else, and still we were traveling in places that were really affordable prices of travel. We didn't travel in Western Europe for too long. We didn't travel in Scandinavia. We didn't travel in Africa. Africa actually tends to be expensive for foreigners who are traveling, living as expats there. And so we did cook a lot. if we ate out, it wasn't at any of these like Michelin-starred restaurants. It wasn't anything that was like sit down with white tablecloths. We tried to live like locals. And I think that one of my other big mantras is when we travel, we don't really try to like check all the boxes running around. Or I used to do this when I was younger and, had more of a thrill of it. But now we just want to like travel modestly and stay somewhere modest. And as people traveling long term, that meant Airbnb-ing, maybe in an apartment. Actually, in Vietnam and Taiwan, it was a studio apartment, 2 of us. And, we made that work. We were out a lot of the time. We were trying to work at cafes. We were sightseeing. We were trying to exercise and eat out, like I mentioned. And there's so much to do. So I think we said, like, why should we spend the bulk of our budget when it's really just going to be somewhere we're going to be sleeping?
Yeah.
And that's typically how we look at like accommodation when we travel. We want to be really comfortable, but we're not going to like overdo it with a ton of frills because we want to have a cushion of the finances and the budget in case something happens. And we have had things happen. Like we've had, medical scares and we've had to see a doctor, and you never really know what that's going to cost because you don't know where having a medical scare is going to, nothing too crazy, but you don't know where that's going to put you. So we try to keep costs down, live simply, again, going along with that minimalist mantra. And I think it gives us both the peace of mind that we never blew the entire budget on accommodation or eating out or, taking an excursion or flying first class, nothing like that. So that's how we kind of like have peace of mind about the whole thing.
Yeah. And there's something to be said of coming back from vacation, not in debt, right? So that's the other thing I think that I really appreciate about minimalism is that trimming the fat so that we're not getting into trouble, which is a great thing. So Becca, thank you so much for sharing your experience here with us on this show today. Where can our listeners find you? On social media, your website, all of that.
Yep, of course. So our website is easy. It's halfhalftravel.com. And then similar to that, on Instagram and Facebook and Pinterest and Twitter, we are also halfhalftravel. So find me there. And if you want to reach out, our website has a contact form where you can reach me directly, and I always reply. So if you want to get in touch, go for it.
Absolutely. Sounds good. And once again, it was so good having you here. Last month on April 9th, we celebrated Global Holistic Wealth Day, which is a yearly thing that we celebrate. And I find that for travel and just the share, in terms of holistic wealth and how we share similar experiences with our neighbors across the globe, wherever they may be. I just find just like, you talking about travel and us discussing everything just really brings that point home to me about how, not only holistic wealth, but how we live and the things that we experience in life have a global impact, and our impact and our reach is really global. So thank you so much, Becca, for being here on the show. I really appreciate hearing your insights. And once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a blast.
The Holistic Wealth Podcast with Keisha Blair is brought to you by... Have you joined the Institute on Holistic Wealth? If you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Choose your membership plan at the Institute on Holistic Wealth/memberships to join. As a member, you'll get access to free worksheets, advice, coaching, and an intentional design workshop. As you start to live a more holistically wealthy lifestyle, you'll want to stay for a very long time. So go to Institute on Holistic Wealth/memberships to join. If you haven't read the book yet, pick up a copy of the award-winning best-selling Holistic Wealth 36 Life Lessons to help you recover from disruption, find your life purpose, and achieve financial freedom.